This is the second part of threats and issues in data security. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the actual threats and talk about a few examples. Now, the goals that we talked about in the last video are all about foreseeing threats. And I divide threats of data security into two umbrella concepts called external and internal. Now, the external threats are the things that we are familiar with in current day and age. We have hacking, phishing, trolling, and so on. Many more. It is everything to do with situations where there's an external actor that is trying either maliciously or unintentionally to access, corrupt, or prevent access to your data. Internal threats are maybe not as obvious to us when we think about traditional security. It is all security threats internal to the system. And to be clear, the system is not just the software. It's the whole combination of the data, every part of the software and its users and developers. Even office buildings and data centers are part of the system. Now, one way of modeling it, not saying that's the correct way to do it, but that's how I do it, is portraying the data as the innermost core, and then that's wrapped in a database interface, which in turn is wrapped in a backend software that acts as an agent between the database and the front end of the software. Now, if the system is a whole company, then we have the employees, the users or clients, and then we might have guests. So where do we draw the line between the internal versus external? The answer is that it depends on the context. So take, for example, you as a client of Netflix would not be an internal actor, as you can't change data or provide new data, well, other than your credit card number, name, and your viewing history. But you only have access to view data through authorization. However, if you're a seller on Amazon, that becomes a bit different maybe as a client. Then you provide data, you have access to data, and you can change things. In that scenario, you can be viewed as an internal actor. Although you don't have full access or full authority, but that's actually one of the means to force internal security. In every company, every system, not every employee or actor has equal rights. They don't have access to all of the stuff. They have access to things and data on a need to know or need to use basis. They have access to certain areas of the software system and to certain areas of the buildings. And even though humans are usually the weakest link in the security chain, it's not only about them. It's also about hardware resources, maintenance practices, and coding practices. Now, the questions you want to ask yourself is, do we have the appropriate hardware, or is it getting old and might break down any second? Are the locks on the doors secure enough? Are our maintenance practices preventing availability? Now, for example, every time we need to update our software system, do we have to close everything down for a week? That there prevents availability of the data. Now, let's have a look at a few examples. An example of an internal threat to confidentiality is, for example, an employee that accidentally replied all to some sensitive data they were asked to provide to the original sender. Or they might have sent an email to multiple clients using copy or CC instead of BCC, and thus disclosing private information. An example of an internal threat to integrity is if you're working on a shared drive, you open a file in the morning and make some changes without saving them. Bad you. Then a coworker modifies the same file at noon and saves. Then When you come back in the afternoon, you finally save your work and thus overwrite your coworkers' changes. Now, internal threats to availability could be as simple as just not having designed the system for its use, not choosing the big enough server, or not having programmed for efficiency. So, whenever 3 or more users log on and start using your software, it slows everything down. External threats are something that we are more familiar with, as I said before. For example, an external threat to confidentiality is simply having your password stolen by either a malicious software or someone looking over your shoulder. External threat to integrity could be the mom of little Bobby Tables, for example, injecting a malicious SQL statement into your software. And then we have what might be the term we probably are most familiar with as an external availability threat: denial of service attacks. More often than not, we cannot fully prevent these threats. Instead, we use mitigating measures. So, for example, we should train our staff in handling sensitive data, and also provide training in protecting our passwords. There is software, of course, available for these situations, but people have to still know how to properly use them. Usually, by default, there's a version control system in place for most shared drive work scenarios, but don't assume, and make sure that it works properly. The only thing you can do about the system not being designed to account for enough capacity is just prepare. Prepare for the worst. Always design with respect to the worst possible scenario. If you think the users will be at least 5, design for 10. The same goes for denial of service attacks. Design for them and be prepared. Assume that you will have to deal with a DDoS attack eventually. As for the threats of SQL injections to the integrity, which actually is an external threat to confidentiality as well, you have to simply sanitize your database inputs. The golden rule here is never trust the input of a user, especially if it's an external user. Always assume the input is wrong from the user and test it.